Hey guys, this is Stacy from eatthebite.com, and today we'll be making savory puff pastry two ways. First, we'll make a butternut squash, goat cheese, and toasted pecan version, and then we'll make one with roasted eggplant, tomato, and gouda. Let's get started on the butternut squash. I cheated a little and bought already cubed butternut squash since they didn't have whole or half squash at my local grocery store yet. Still, I needed the cubes to be a little bit smaller, so I cut them into even smaller pieces, which will work much better for the puff pastry. So I took each cube and cut it into 4 more little pieces. So they should be just about the size you see here, and we'll need 2 cups of that for our recipe. Next, I had some fresh thyme that I need to pull from the stems, and I have a lot of it. We only need about a teaspoon for this recipe, but I'll use the rest of it later in the week when I make a roasted chicken. And if you only have dried thyme, that's fine too. You want to grab a few stems and then pinch them from the top down, running your fingers down the stem to remove the tiny leaves. Also remember, a little fresh thyme goes a long way. It can be an overwhelming flavor if you use too much of it. Even though the leaves are already pretty small, I still want to give them a little chop to make the pieces a bit finer. You'll need 2 pans for this, one to lightly toast your pecans on low heat for about 5 to 8 minutes, and the other for the butternut squash. You'll put your butternut squash in a pan with a little olive oil, salt, pepper, and of course the fresh thyme that we just chopped. Once you do that, you want to give it a good toss around the pan a couple of times. And then we're going to put a lid on it. Your heat should be low to medium at this point, and we'll steam the squash until it's tender all the way through. Then we'll just give our pecans a little turn around the pan, and we'll get going on the egg wash. Just beat 1 egg and a splash of water, and we'll brush it on our pastry before it goes in the oven. I use a store-bought puff pastry for this recipe, and it comes in a pack of 2. It really tastes delicious, and it cuts the workload down if you're trying to make a quicker meal for you and your family. If you want to make 1 large puff pastry, you could combine the 2 sheets of dough and roll it out to a larger size. For me, I'm using 1 at a time and making a smaller puff pastry. So you just want to lay the dough onto a parchment paper lined sheet pan. Next, I'm going to take about a 1/2 inch around all of the sides to create a more defined crust. And just try to even it out where you can and fold over or press down any of the little flaps that happen at the corners. After we smooth out our crust, we'll drizzle a little olive oil on the dough and brush it evenly across the dough. And as you can see, I didn't put quite enough olive oil on there the first time, so I did drizzle a little bit extra to make sure I could get all the areas covered. After we've brushed all of our oil, we're going to add our yummy butternut squash. You just want to spoon the squash out across the entire bottom so that it's evenly distributed, just like you see here. I bought a 4-ounce pack of goat cheese, but I'll only be using 2 ounces for this recipe. I love goat cheese, so it won't go to waste. I can use it on salads or make some kind of French bread pizza later in the week. And yes, it probably would have been easier to buy the already crumbled goat cheese, but I found it can get a little pricey. Goat cheese can get a bit messy. So I'll hold it in the plastic wrapper while I slice my chunks of cheese until I've covered the whole pastry. And of course, by the end of this process, you will have
goat cheese fingers.
I've let my lightly toasted nuts cool completely at this point, and I want to sprinkle them on top of the squash and goat cheese. I found that if you don't toast them before cooking the puff pastry, they don't get the flavor and crunch I'm looking for. All that's left now is to brush our egg wash on the crust of our delicious puff pastry, and then we'll put it in the oven. I've already preheated my oven to 400 degrees, and I'll let the puff pastry cook for about 15 to 20 minutes until I can see it browning and puffing up on the edges. And there it is in all its glory. That crisp brown crust, the softness of the squash and goat cheese with the crunch of the pecans and the crust, it's a great combination. But I'm not going to eat the bite just yet. It's time to make the eggplant puff pastry. So let's get started on that. We'll start with the tomatoes. This probably looks familiar if you've seen my tomato bruschetta video. We'll start with 6 small to medium vine-ripe tomatoes. And you'll want to core, slice in half, and remove the seeds. Instead of cutting the tomato from the core, top to bottom, I find it's better to slice the tomato in half from the middle of the tomatoes. I'll use my fingers to scrape out the seeds and juice, and make sure you have a bowl ready for that because it gets messy. Then I'm going to place my tomatoes in a baking dish. We're going to grab that olive oil and drizzle the oil all over the tomatoes, making sure some of it is reaching the bottom of the baking dish so my tomatoes don't get stuck there. Then I'll sprinkle a little salt and pepper over the top. I'm going to set those aside so I can prepare my eggplant as well. And even though they have different cook times, I will eventually put them in the oven at the same time. So after we've seasoned our tomatoes, we set those aside. And first we'll cut the top and bottom off the eggplant. Next, we want to slice the eggplant into 1/2-inch slices. You want to be careful not to make the eggplant slices too thin or too thick, because a lot of vegetables shrink when they're cooked. If the eggplant is too thin, it will fall apart when you try to lift it off the sheet pan. If it's too thick, it won't be the right size to match the puff pastry we're making. So keeping it to 1/2-inch slice is the perfect size. We're going to place the eggplant onto a parchment paper lined sheet pan. Then we'll get our olive oil and we'll drizzle our olive oil on the top of each eggplant. And then after you do that, you want to quickly take your pastry brush to spread the oil across each slice. And don't forget your seasoning here. It's really important to season as you go. So we'll put a little sprinkling of salt and pepper on the top. And then you'll flip the eggplant actually and do the exact same thing on the other side. I put both the eggplant and tomatoes into a preheated oven at 400 degrees. The eggplant was finished in about 20 minutes, but the tomatoes take about 45 minutes to an hour. And remember, you can always roast the tomatoes and eggplant the day before. And I've obviously made more tomatoes and eggplant than I need for this recipe, but I love making roasted veggie sandwiches with the leftovers, and it's so easy to do that. Okay, now we're ready to assemble the puff pastry. As you can see, I've got my gorgeous plate of roasted eggplant and my other gorgeous plate of roasted tomatoes. I had some Gouda cheese on hand, so I decided to put it to use. If you're using a block of cheese, you'll need to shred it like I'm doing here. And I used about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of cheese total. So now I have my eggplant, tomatoes, and shredded Gouda. Just these 3 simple ingredients to make a gourmet puff pastry. Okay, so once again, I unfold my store-bought puff pastry onto a parchment paper-lined sheet pan. And once I've done that, I can start to fold over the edges at about 1/2 inch. I want to create a bit more of a defined crust. And remember, if you have little flaps at the corners, you can either fold them over or press them down like I'm doing here so that everything is nice and even. And after we've done that, I'll get my olive oil and I'll drizzle a little bit on the bottom. Then I'll take my pastry brush to spread it around. And now we're ready for the eggplant. I take 4 eggplant pieces of roughly the same size and place them on the bottom of the dough. And as you can see, it is a very selective process. Only the most elite eggplant will make it onto this dough. Next, we'll take 4 roasted tomato halves. Another competitive process where only the best shaped tomatoes will be chosen. And we get to that last one, and no, sorry buddy, A-team only. We'll take my 1/2 cup or so of shredded Gouda and scatter it onto the top. Just a little more cheese. Next, I'll take the egg wash and brush it along the entire crust. And then it goes right into my preheated oven at 400 degrees. And 15 to 20 minutes later, you'll get this delicious treat. Oh, I love how that eggplant, tomato, and melted cheese looks. And I can't wait to sink my teeth into this one. So we've got both of our puff pastries ready to go now. We've got our butternut squash, goat cheese, and pecan, as well as our eggplant, tomato, and Gouda. And you know what that means. It's time to eat the bite, guys. And what a delicious bite that was. I love the combination of the soft ingredients and the crunch of the pecans and the crust. And the eggplant. Why aren't we making more eggplant in life? But you know what really made this was the roasted tomatoes. They're so easy to make and it can really elevate your flavors. Also, I added a little chopped basil at the end, which is optional of course, but I highly recommend it. Okay guys, that's all for today. You'll find the complete recipes on my website at eatthebite.com. And if you like this video, feel free to go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you next time.